But just briefly, I'm an area agent in southeastern Arizona in community resource development. And I am the only community resource development agent in the state at this time. And so when Roz asked me to chair this panel, I was really excited to have the chance to have myself and others present the principles of sustainability in action. And in this particular session as it applies to the land. And I think Mr. Buchanan set us up beautifully for this session in talking about how the idea of land and the way we treat our land runs through everything we do, whether it's food or energy or water. And so I'm hoping that we can give you a couple of good case examples of some programs in extension here in the West that seem to be working pretty successfully as it relates to the land. We often get wrapped up in explaining sustainability to our clients in terms of the way it applies to the 3 Ps, people, prosperity, and planet. But making it really relevant to our day-to-day programs is our biggest challenge. And it's really the most important part of our work, I think. So, especially where land is concerned. So, land is really not a renewable resource, unless, of course, you're the country of Dubai, and where they are creating new subdivisions and resorts out of dredged sand. Or if you happen to be in Hawaii, where since 1983, the volcano on Kilauea has added over 500 acres of new land to the Big Island. But out here in the West, land seems like it's an infinite resource when we look around at all of the open spaces we have in the West. I think we're really fortunate here in the West to be able to see what the potential is for protecting and conserving a resource that we still have. So many places in the East are just remnants of what used to be. And so we're often overcome out here in the West by the vastness and beauty of our landscapes. But the impacts of population expansion and growth around our cities and rural areas are really well documented. Does anybody recognize this? It's the Wasatch Range and Salt Lake City. So you can see a simple Google Earth photo. So really the idea is, how do we make the case for extension in land use and sustainability outreach efforts? And on your thumb drives, I've included an article that myself and my colleague Eric Glenn wrote back in 2008 for the WRDC Rural Connections. It's a brief on making the case for land use as an extension activity, especially here in the West. And we've got a number of reasons why that's so important. The first one being population growth. And despite the downturn in the economy in Arizona, Arizona still ranks as the second fastest growing state in the country at 24.6% for the last decade. Nevada is number 1 at 34.1% per the 2010 census. And since 1980 and 2000, between 1980 and 2006, 8 of the 11 fastest growing states in the United States were in the West. So when we get an influx of new residents, there's bound to be some conflicts and consequences. In some Western communities, either now or in the future, the newcomers that are coming to our state or are already in our state will soon outnumber the families who've lived there for generations. So this is creating some cultural conflicts as well, this popular billboard. New residents mean changes, and not always agreeable changes. I think this photograph should be called Topiary Moon. So, has anybody here read William Travis's book, New Geographies for the American West? It was released in 2008. Dr. Travis is a professor at Colorado University out of Boulder, and is an integral part of the Center for American West. And they've done some, although not an extension program, they've done some really interesting land use research and studies about the West. And in his book, he describes that nationally there is 10 times more land that's consumed by exurban development than urban or suburban development. And in Arizona alone, between 1982 and 2007, the total amount of rural land that was converted to development, i.e. commercial or residential development, was nearly 416,000 acres. And these maps here show the actual land use changes from 1960 to 1990 and projected changes out to the year 2050. And these different colors represent urban development, low-density suburban development, and the one that I really would hope folks pay attention to is this yellow, bright yellow one for exurban development. And I'm going to get into in a minute here what exurban development means. Now, a little caveat, these projections were developed just before the Great Recession, but should still serve as a guide to what could happen if the housing market picks up again, especially out here in the West. So what does exurban mean? Are people familiar with the term exurban or exurban development? It's really the type of land use pattern that we've seen here in the West over the last couple of decades. They're a type of spatial pattern of settlement that really differs from their suburban counterparts. Exurbs are located at greater distances from cities and from suburban areas. They're not necessarily connected. They're mostly not connected to suburban areas. Sometimes people think of these kinds of development as just more suburbs, but really what distinguishes them is that A, they've taken rural lands out of development, and B, they are generally located at the beginning pretty far away from incorporated city boundaries. You'll see a lot of ranches and farmland. These are mostly interspersed among active farms and ranches, and they vary in sizes from 1 to 40 acre parcels. You'll sometimes, such as new subdivisions or exclusive estates or ranchettes, mobile homes, and often these kinds of developments create conflicts between traditional ag uses and the new residents that have moved in who don't like the smell of the feedlot next door or the dairy farm next door. But in spite of its low densities, usually these are lower density developments, many residents' commitment to living lightly on the land, the compounded effects of the exurban development pattern are really difficult to overcome. So as I mentioned just a minute ago, this kind of development pattern accounts for 10 times more land than is currently in suburban and urban development. So even though we think our cities are huge and sprawling, they are only a tenth the size of the amount of land that has been eaten up by exurban development. And what we see, some of the impacts we see from that are fragmentation of landscapes and impacts to wildlife habitat and wildlife corridors. We see an introduction of pets and non-native vegetation. We see a disruption of natural processes like hydrologic recharge areas, floodplains, things like that. We see an exacerbation of wildland fire hazards, most recently in Colorado. A lot of those developments up in the hills outside of Boulder and Denver were considered exurban developments. And we see a proliferation of septic tanks that create a really dangerous buildup of nitrates in the soil. Now, Greg earlier today gave us an overview, and so some of this might be a little bit redundant, but it is certainly worth hitting home, that climate change really is the elephant in the room. And so climate change is really the reason why sustainability becomes so important and why it's important for us to put the principles of sustainability into practice. And rural areas are particularly vulnerable to the effects of climate change. And out here in the Southwest, we've seen drought and wildfire, but a few of those direct impacts on the land that we're seeing right now. This report that Greg mentioned earlier, the assessment of climate change in the Southwest United States, which Greg didn't note, but he headed up this report and was released earlier. And this is a precursor to the national assessment that's due out here anytime. But this represents what's going on here in the Southwest and what's projected to happen here in the Southwest. And it represents the findings of 120 authors from a variety of scientific disciplines, as well as regional stakeholder input and independent review. So this isn't just a bunch of scientists getting together in a little back room and cranking out projections, et cetera. This was really a much larger effort. So it examines what climate and climate change mean for the health and well-being of the Southwest's human populations and environment in an area that encompasses about 700,000 square miles, including California, Arizona, Utah, Nevada, Colorado, and New Mexico. So these are some of the key findings from that report. I'm not going to read through them, but what's interesting on the key findings on this particular slide represent the impacts that we're seeing right now. These aren't projected. These are the things that are happening right now in real time. The findings touch on the impacts to agriculture, coastal areas, and energy delivery systems. Greg got into a lot of these, the costly relocations of crops and changes in management of those crops. Also the changes in ag transportation networks, rising sea levels, high tides, and also there's a huge risk to the delivery of our infrastructure like electricity and water, which these things become imperiled by heat waves and droughts. Also, this report goes into the impact on cities, disadvantaged populations, tribal entities, and border populations. Since I've got 5 minutes left, I'll run through these. So these increased severity and frequency of these events is not news to any of us. We see it on the news every night. There is one glimmer of optimism that's expressed in that report, the last key finding of the assessment, and that is the Southwest has historically had a great capacity to respond to environmental stress and steward its natural resources. The assessment highlights examples of current successful climate change initiatives and strategies and characterizes the co-benefits of adaptation and mitigation. So it's not all bad news. There are some really great ideas in the report about how we could progress forward. So what do our universities have to offer in terms of addressing climate change and sustainability? Well, our land-based resources sustainable development and our land-based resources are inextricably linked. Our universities have an abundance of knowledge and resources that we as extension agents should be taking advantage of on behalf of our clientele. And these are some of the things that extension in our university and as well as many others have to offer our communities with regard to sustainable development. And these resources as well touch upon the kinds of programs that I'm delivering as a community resource development agent in Arizona that focuses mostly on land use planning, training decision makers and planning officials on some of the principles of sustainability under the guise of sustainable development and smart growth, things like that. The makeup of our clientele is really expanding. In Arizona's extension, while we traditionally and aptly serve agricultural stakeholders, we're now also serving backyard, urban, school, and community gardeners. Oops, it's jumping ahead here a little bit. Citizen planners, rainwater harvesters, and others desiring a smaller footprint on the land. This is a photo from a renewable resources workshop that I organized for some agricultural and residential interest down in my part of the county. I just want to mention a couple of resources real quick with regard to land use and land use planning. Vivian highlighted the resources available through ANREP and our National Network for Sustainable Living Education initiative. We've got a whole host of resources and database on who's doing what on the ANREP site. We also have E-Extension's land use COP. If you were just to get into E-Extension, it's actually called Community Planning and Zoning Community of Practice. And there's a whole host of resources. I was on the leadership team to pull together the content for that particular website. So if you're interested in land use issues, land use planning, as well as sustainable development, it's become the home of Nestle's, one of the homes of Nestle's sustainable development resources, including our online course. The point is, really, regardless of your particular extension discipline, we all have a role to play in the quest for sustainability, regardless of what program you have. Ultimately, our collective choices impact the land and our beloved landscapes, either positively or negatively. So in this last group of panelists, we'll be hearing about a new tool for engaging farmers in Washington, as well as payment for ecosystem services and sustainable rangelands in Wyoming. So I'd like to invite our first speaker, Diana Roberts, up to talk about her farmer-to-farmer education program in the state of Washington.